Meantime, we're going to move on to our next presentation. Alicia, you should be able to share your screen whenever you're ready, so feel free to do that while I read your intro. Next up, we have duct tape integration, developing an automated copy order fulfillment workflow with ArchivesSpace, Preservica, and Aon. In this presentation, Alicia Detelich Boersig of Yale University Library will develop a recent Yale University Library manuscripts and archives project to develop an automated copy order fulfillment workflow for already digitized materials. The workflow was developed mid-pandemic to cope with increased reprographic requests and relies on queries and scripts which connect several systems. Topics will include using the ArchivesSpace API to ingest links to digital content, leveraging the ArchivesSpace Reports module to identify digitally available materials, and the development of a set of scripts which combine data from ArchivesSpace and Google Sheets to download files from Preservica, share them via Box, and send the shared links to patrons via Aon. Welcome, Alicia.
Thanks very much. It's kind of a lot, I know.
It is.
So hi everyone, thanks for coming, and thanks definitely to Jessica and to the team for putting this all together. So as Jessica said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent project that I led to mostly automate the fulfillment of digital copy requests for materials that are held by my department, manuscripts and archives, which had already been digitized and ingested into our digital preservation system, which is Preservica, but which weren't available publicly online. And for a variety of reasons, a large majority of digitized materials at Yale fall into this category. So digitized, but not available online. So the project involves stitching together several different systems in a way that I think is possibly a bit amateurish, but actually works very well for our purposes, and which we were able to implement in a relatively short period of time. And this work has served as sort of an effective stopgap solution while we have longer term development taking place. And so I'm hoping that by sharing this today, you'll be inspired to take a good enough approach to solving your workflow problems. I hope that this will inspire you to think about new ways to leverage your ArchivesSpace data to meet your various operational needs, and also to maybe consider how you might automate some of your own really time-consuming processes. So there is some technical knowledge required in order to implement a process like this, but it's absolutely something that an archivist could do. So I want to give a bit of background on the project and on the problem that it was meant to solve. So at the beginning of the pandemic, when our reading room closed, the number of digital copy requests that we received increased dramatically. The number of new digitization requests alone overwhelmed the staff members in our digital services unit, which was really only comprised of a couple of people at that time. So during the first few months of the pandemic, digital services staff and public services staff had worked out a sort of like manual basic process for handling orders for materials which were already digitized. And so basically a public services staff member would work with a patron via email to try to identify the materials they were seeking copies of and to determine, somehow whether those materials had already been digitized. This was primarily done by the staff member visually inspecting the finding aids for digital object records and for these unpublished notes we have, which are the primary indicators that something has been digitized and ingested into Preservica. I want to explain quickly about how we use digital objects at Yale. So mostly digital objects here serve as a kind of linking system between ArchivesSpace and other systems that we use at Yale. So for instance, we have some digital objects like this one, which link out to our old, soon to be retired digital library. This is only a small minority of things, and these are usually published, which allows you to click on them and access them online via that thumbnail. And then we also have some other digital objects, which are very similar, also published, which link out to Aviary, which is our access system for AV materials. Most commonly, though, we have digital objects that are unpublished, which link to Preservica. And so these digital objects are actually created by Preservica during ingest as part of the ArchivesSpace Preservica sync functionality. So I have a link here to a webinar actually put on by Lyrasis about the connector. So I won't talk like a whole lot about this, But basically, when digitized material is ingested into Preservica, the process that manages the ingest can be passed in ArchivesSpace URI, which then enables the connector to link the Preservica metadata that's created during the ingest back to an ArchivesSpace record. The connector creates two records, a digital object record, which includes a link to what's called a deliverable unit in Preservica. And so this is sort of analogous to a digital object record. And then that digital object record is linked as an instance to the archival object record that was passed in. And so the second record is a note subrecord, which is in the archival object itself, which includes a link to what's called a collection in Preservica, which is a record that's sort of analogous to an archival object record. And so this sync functionality provides us with like a basic linking between the two systems. Again, the digital object records and notes created by Preservica were the primary way that public services staff members were able to identify digital materials. And so once the materials were identified, what public services staff would do is basically copy and paste the links for each order from the Preservica note in the archival object into an email, and then they would send it to the head of digitization or digital services. They also would create an order for the patron in Aon, and would record the order number, patron name, Aon username, and some other data about the order in a Google Sheet. So once the head of digitization received the order, he would click on each of the links in the email, navigate through the Preservica UI, and download all associated files, access copy files for each order. And then he'd zip the files up for each patron, upload them to basically like a homegrown secure file transfer service at Yale. So finally, the head of digitization would create the email in Aon and then manually update it with the patron information from the Google Sheet, and then he would send the emails. So here's an example just real quick of the digital objects that are created by Preservica. And so here's the link out to the deliverable unit, and then this is the note that's created during that process. So basically, in the summer of 2020, it became pretty clear that the process that they had been using was not going to be sustainable long term. The orders were taking like 2 to 4 weeks to fill, even though the files were already available. And then staff in the digitization unit were needed to prioritize, new digitization requests. We didn't have any student workers that were available, and there just wasn't like enough time or staff resources available to do all this work. And so at that point, I was called in to try to come up with sort of an automated solution to this problem. I spent some time during late summer and early fall developing the project plan and starting to develop the workflow. And then by early spring 2021, archives assistants in public and digital services were fully trained to manage the parts of the process which were not automated. So also while I was planning this project, I was given the responsibility of fulfilling the orders. So I had some motivation to speed up the process because it really was taking forever to do. So I want to sort of give a step-by-step overview of the process that I developed, and then I'll talk in detail about a couple pieces of it. So in the new process, public services staff continue to be the primary point of contact for researchers who are looking for digital copies. So as of right now, there is still no mechanism for users to request digital copies directly from the public user interface to Aon. We have implemented the Aon plugin to allow for reading room requests, but we are currently developing and have finished development, but have sort of had a delayed implementation for a variety of reasons. The ability to request digital copies from Aon. And so basically public services staff kind of still have to be involved, and the first few steps are about the same as they were in the previous process. So public services staff work with a patron, identify materials they want copies of, and then they record the patron data and get them registered as needed. So step 4 is kind of where the big change happens. So in the new process, public services staff members will run a report from the ArchivesSpace staff interface reports module. they enter one or more call numbers into a search bar, and the report returns information about all digitally available material in the collection or collections. Staff members will then open this file and locate materials requested by the researcher. This can be done in a few different ways, usually by searching the report for the URI or using the box and folder number to try to find, or the title, or various points of reference. So the first column of the report is blank, and then public services staff make an X in that column, or some mark for each file they want to download and send to the patron. Staff then save the report as a new file in a specific folder on our department's network drive. The report's named with the first and last name of the patron, along with the order number. This is pretty important, as it allows us to kind of track each order as it goes through the various steps. And eventually it helps us link that order number back to the AON account. So staff do this throughout the week. And then every Thursday morning at 9:15 in the morning, a set of scripts is triggered to run via a cron job, which is essentially just like a job scheduler. And so the scripts that run do a few different things. So the first thing it does is check the network drive for new spreadsheets. If it finds a spreadsheet, it creates a temporary directory for each order using the first name, last name, order number, and naming convention. It opens each spreadsheet, which includes the Preservica links. It calls the Preservica API and then downloads the marked files for each order. And it saves those files in the folder for each order. So once the files for all the orders are downloaded, another script sort of packaged those folders into zip files, one for each order, using the same naming convention. The next script will take those package files and upload them to Box via the Box API. And then a shared link is created, which expires after 10 days. The script then calls the Google Sheets API and pulls all unfulfilled order data from the tracking spreadsheet that public services use to track the orders. And then finally, a report is created, which includes the box link along with the AON data and other patron data. And this basically provides a linkage between the original order and the box files. So then as the report is created, a text file with sort of a standard email text is also created as well. And I'll explain in a second sort of why we do that. So, with the report and the templates in hand, a staff member in digital services on Friday mornings finds each user in AON with their username and then sends the email via the AON email plugin. And we do this basically to kind of track our photo duplication requests. So that's kind of a rough overview of what we implemented. I want to talk a little bit about sort of what we had to do to get there. So the first thing that I had to do was get a better understanding of Preservica and the Preservica data model. And basically I had to learn how to use the Preservica API to programmatically identify digital files and figure out how to download them from Preservica. Staff members in our digital preservation unit are the only ones who have access to the database. So I had to use the API to do all of this. And I also realized sort of as I was doing this that, the Preservica links that are added to ArchivesSpace during the sync process aren't actually the links to the digital files themselves, but they're actually links to other record types in Preservica, the collections and deliverable units, as I mentioned above. And this is for version 5 of Preservica. So I couldn't just use the identifiers in the ArchivesSpace records to pull the digital files. I needed to do some additional steps to actually get to the stuff. So after some experimentation, I came up with a fairly efficient way to extract and download digital file data for Preservica access copies using the identifiers that were found in the ArchivesSpace records. So kind of long story short, there are ways to formulate your API calls in Preservica version 5 that allow you to retrieve nested data for certain record types without having to go through the entire record hierarchy to get to the actual file. And I'll have some links to the scripts that I used to do all this at the end. So once I determined a method for pulling the digital file data and connecting it back to ArchivesSpace, I had to sort of figure out how to manage all the data. So initially I just had it all in a spreadsheet, but then I kind of just decided that I would put it in a small database. So basically I would extract data from Preservica, put it in a database, and also extract some data from ArchivesSpace and put that in the database. And so like there are other ways to do this, but I found that during development, it was easiest to kind of store the data locally. That made things more flexible and made it easier to test. And I didn't have to, call the Preservica API as many times to retrieve the same data. And so when I was doing my local testing, I basically kind of worked within this little area. And so eventually, though, a big decision that I made was to take the digital file links that I was pulling from Preservica, and I actually uploaded that data via the ArchivesSpace API into the file version subrecords of the existing digital objects from Preservica. And so that basically allowed me to create a much more direct link between the Preservica files and the ArchivesSpace files, because those digital file links which actually, when you called them, would download the file itself, were actually in the digital object record. And so depending on, the future of this workflow, we may update the ArchivesSpace Preservica sync to include those digital file links, but that's more of a longer term project, and it requires some coordination outside or across the library. And then we are also sort of in the middle of upgrading to Preservica v6, which includes a pretty substantial change to the data model. And so I think we wanted to wait until after that was complete to do any more work on the sync. And so in addition to the digital filings from Preservica, around this time, I also used the ArchivesSpace API to create a whole bunch of existence and locations of copies notes and some conditions governing access notes. And this just basically made it easier for patrons to see what was available digitally. And this helped public services a lot when working with patrons to identify materials that folks needed copies of. And I'll note again that we're currently wrapping up development on a plugin which more clearly indicates to users that materials are available digitally. And it actually allows them to filter search results to just include digital materials, which they can then request directly. But again, this has taken a pretty good amount of time to implement, and we really couldn't afford to wait until it was finished. So we decided to kind of go with the note approach as sort of a stopgap. And so here is an example of a digital file link that we added to the digital object record. And so it just has some basic information about the file. And then if you actually click on that link and have access to Preservica, you can download it. And then at the bottom here is just a note, an example of the notes that we added. Okay, so one of the main reasons that I wanted to update the digital object records to include those files was so that we could take advantage of the ArchivesSpace reports module to select these digital files. So the refactored reports were released in 2018, and this has basically made it really easy to add custom SQL queries and to manage them via a plugin. And this has had a whole bunch of benefits for us. But mostly it just lowers the barrier for staff to run reports against ArchivesSpace data. So I had already been using this prior to the project and was kind of looking for ways to kind of implement it more broadly. And so this was a good opportunity for that. So after I created all those digital file links, I created a report in the plugin that, given one or more call numbers, which are stored in the identifier field of a resource record, you'd retrieve all digital file links associated with that collection or collections. Let's see if I can. And so here's just kind of like a little walkthrough of the report. So you got this report here, and then you can enter call numbers separated by a comma, and then it'll run it. And then let's see, here's an example of the output of the report. And so you see there's this first column here, a link to our public interface, a lot of data about it, and then here are the actual the files. And so, most of the time there's just a single PDF or single whatever for each archival object record, but occasionally we have folder ranges, and in that case there may be more than one, and public services staff have been trained in that case just to mark all files. So to the show. Okay, so that's basically kind of the rough go through of it. And so, you know, once that data was in place and the report was in place, the rest of the process was actually like pretty straightforward to develop. You know, I noticed that it took a really long time in itself just to like zip the files up and manually upload them to the secure file transfer service. So the next piece I did was basically automating that. Like packaging zip files in Python is really easy. So I did that first. And then I decided to switch the delivery platform from this like homegrown file transfer service, which didn't have an API, to the Yale box service, which does. And from that point, I was able to automate it pretty easily, you know, automate pretty easily the packaging of the uploading of the files to the service and then creating the shared links. Honestly, like the most difficult part of that process was working with ITS or centralized IT to set up a service account for the box script. But after I was able to get that done, everything else was really fine. And I would say like the largest roadblock to fully automating the process beyond, you know, actually getting the files together is the fact that the Aeon API at Yale is not like turned on, in the sense that only certain applications can access it. And so sending and generating the emails with we couldn't really send the emails directly using the Aeon API. So basically what I had to do was determine how to connect those fulfilled orders back to the Aeon user that made the request so that staff could just send the emails with the file links to the patrons. And so that's kind of why I used the Google Sheets. So public services staff had already been using this tracking spreadsheet. And, you know, obviously Google has a pretty robust set of APIs. So I figured that I could just kind of pull data from there, combine it with Box and into this new report. And that would sort of, you know, serve as a pretty easy way to solve this issue. And so basically what I did kind of with that is to use the order number as the key. And so as the files went through the process, you know, the script looked for the order number, and that's how it kind of brought all of that data back together into the report. And then the text file includes an email template that can basically be copied and pasted into the Aeon form that's sent to the patron. And so this basically like limits the amount of time the digital services staff have to spend copying and pasting different things into this email template. It's not like a perfect solution, but it works for us while we sort of wait for more broad access. And so that's pretty much it. Our staff member sends them Friday morning. I'm available, you know, if there are any issues, but for the most part, you know, it has been pretty straightforward. I had to train staff a little bit in the process. So I held a training session in early 2021. I've had a couple different training sessions to kind of keep people up to speed. I'm always available to answer questions. And then I have linked here is the documentation that I've used to train staff. And then finally, because I think I'm a little over here, the process has really had a very significant positive impact on our operations. Turnaround time for these kinds of orders has decreased by 2 to 3 weeks. And then rather than relying on senior staff, we now rely only on archives assistants to manage the portions of the process which aren't automated. And we have sent nearly 4,000 files to patrons via this process. Some ongoing work is necessary to maintain the process. We have to keep the digital file links and notes updated. And as part of the development process for this project, I also developed a method for basically doing that, which is relatively straightforward as well. And then I'm hoping that longer term, you know, these records will actually be created during the sync process. But again, that's still sort of TBD. And then finally, you know, I don't really know what the future is of this process. There's a lot that's currently going on at Yale that will hopefully sort of obviate the need for this kind of like haphazard integration, like the development of our new digital collection system, which will hopefully be integrated with Preservica and ArchivesSpace so that, you know, as things are digitized, they're automatically available in our digital collection system, and also, that is reflected in ArchivesSpace as well as the ability to request digital copies and filter for digital materials, and then all of these other changes listed here, which really call all of this into question. But some of this stuff has been going on for over 2 years, so it was really necessary to come up with a solution that worked for us, and we were able to get off the ground relatively quickly. So I think that's it for me. Sorry that I went a bit over. Here is all the info that you need to kind of take a look at this, and I think we'll share these slides later. So thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. That was great. We have 5 minutes for questions. So if you have a question for Alicia, please be sure to drop it into the Q&A. We've got a couple already. This question came in about 10 minutes ago. So sorry, Jerry, you may need to clarify, but he asked what type of database was used.
Yeah, so for the little reporting database, that was, I just used MySQL. I mean, you could use whatever. It really, I mean, it's pretty lightweight, but that's what I used.
Thanks. Would the digital collection system make Preservica redundant?
No, I don't think so. So we don't use like the open access viewer in Preservica, and we don't really have plans to do that. So what the digital collections system will do is, as things are digitized and ingested into Preservica, the DCS will, on a nightly basis, search for newly ingested materials and basically pull that stuff into the DCS so that users can have access to it. So Preservica doesn't really have, we don't use any sort of access system through Preservica. So this would be that kind of front end access. But preservation and digitization stuff will all be managed still through Preservica.
Cool, thanks. Can you talk more about your digital collection system?
Yes, yeah, it's kind of complicated, as you might expect. So we had an old digitization digital library system that sort of didn't really meet our needs anymore. It was homegrown and like it kind of got out of control after a while. And so we've been developing this new system for the last couple of years, and the idea is that it will basically, again, pull from different systems into the digital collection system and then provide access. We also we are currently developing synchronization between ArchivesSpace and that system. So basically, as things are ingested into the digital collection system, data about that will be basically added similarly to like how the Preservica digital objects are added. Digital objects for each digital DCS record will also be added, and that will include the thumbnail that people can then just link out directly from Archives at Yale, which is our PUI. And I can talk like more about the details of the system itself, maybe offline if you have questions. It's sort of complicated, as you might expect.
Thanks, Alicia. All right, we have 2 more minutes before your session is technically over. So if anyone has a last minute question, now is your chance to get it in. I'm trying to speak slowly in case anyone has anything they'd like to say. Otherwise, yeah, thank you, Alicia. Thank you so much for this presentation. Oh, wait, a question. As soon as I start, that always happens. What kind of testing have you done with Preservica 6?
So we're in the middle of upgrading to V6 right now. And basically what I need to do, I've done some basic testing with the V6 API, which is significantly different. But I haven't, I still need to basically update a lot of the scripts that I've written to make sure that I can still pull data in the same way. And so I've done some minimal testing, like just basically modeling it and figuring out like, so I have this record that used to correspond to a deliverable unit. How do I get the digital file from that? And it's So that's kind of basically where I'm at, is kind of mapping out the calls that I need to make to get that data. And then, you know, on a larger scale, there are other people across Yale Library who are doing testing for, you know, different things that use Preservica, but that's primarily the kind of testing that I'm focused on right now, and as it applies basically to this work.